Coming up at the end of this month, be sure to catch our two-part special, Canada in the Great War. We focus on the rise of General Sir Arthur Currie.
Arthur Currie was as unlikely a candidate for war hero as ever set foot on a parade ground. Physically unfit and a failure in business before the war, citizen soldier Currie, after having commanded no more than 400 men during peacetime, had risen from relative military obscurity to command of the elite fighting machine on the Western Front, the Canadian Corps.
And we march alongside Canadian forces as they spearhead the last 100 days of World War I.
Unlike many previous battles, there would be no preliminary bombardment until 0 hour, 4:20 a.m. August the 8th. More than 900 guns were set to fire at that moment, followed quickly by the advance of nearly 600 tanks and 1,900 aircraft. And waves of infantry would begin the march of the last 100 days.
Don't miss Canada in the Great War, January 24th and 31st, only on Point of the Spear. Welcome to the final episode of Hamilton at War, our 12-part weekly podcast series that is brought to life in vivid, historical, and emotional detail Alexander Hamilton's Revolutionary War service. I'm Robert Child, and I hope you enjoy this final installment.
Hamilton at War, written by Robert Child and narrated by James Gillis. Yorktown Harbor, Virginia. A black night sky was illuminated by a shell with trailing red fire that screamed, arching into the British fortress at Yorktown. It hit its target with a terrific explosion. The fort lit up and revealed much destruction around the British stronghold. Scattered, wounded British soldiers moaned, and countless starving runaway slaves, turned out of British lines by Cornwallis's need to preserve rations, wandered frightened in the no-man's land between the lines. The American battery relentlessly pounded the fort from all sides. Henry Knox, all business, crossed back and forth, directing fire from behind his unending rows of cannon. Hamilton, now in possession of a field command, with a force of 400 light infantrymen, was gathered outside the opening of a trench. An 18-foot-high square structure of sod and masonry loomed in the distance, lit by the flashes of artillery. It was British Redoubt No. 10, and it was the objective of Hamilton's men once they exited the other end of the trench. At the mouth of this trench, Hamilton stood next to 23-year-old Major Nicholas Fish, his old friend from King's College, now his second in command. "Major Fish, instruct the men," Hamilton ordered. Fish saluted Hamilton. Both wore the hardened look of soldiers. Fish said, "Men, tonight demands your soldierly courage. We attack with the bayonet alone. A single misfire would alert the enemy to our surprise approach. Fix bayonets!" The clatter of steel bayonets on hundreds of muskets began as the pounding of artillery continued in the distance. Inside Redoubt No. 10 was 30-year-old Major John Campbell of the 71st Regiment of Foot. His face and feathered Highland bonnet came into view, illuminated by the artillery flashes. He looked as if he sensed something was wrong. He reached the redoubt's officer of the guard. "Have the sentries be ever vigilant tonight." The officer of the guard asked, "What is it, sir?" "I'm not entirely certain." Back at the mouth of the trench, Washington with Lafayette had arrived on horseback. All bayonets were now fixed. Washington said, "Men, the attack tonight is a culmination of all that has come before. Act your part as firm and brave soldiers of the cause. The outcome of the war may rest in your hands this night." The men looked to one another. They were ready for a fight. Washington turned to Hamilton and issued a sharp salute. Hamilton returned it, beaming. Washington then gave him a warm "good luck" nod, and quickly cantered away. Lafayette then rode up to Hamilton. "Good luck, my friend," Lafayette said, then arched back and gave Hamilton a powerful and crisp salute. Hamilton returned it, and then walked to the front of his men. He took a moment and looked several in the eye before he spoke. "Men, those fortress walls are defended by soldiers who fight for pay. We fight for something far dearer, our liberty and a new American nation. Know this: the justice of our cause and the bravery of the men beside you do not allow me to consider that victory is not within our grasp." He turned and pointed to the redoubt. "The end of the long journey we have travelled together waits those 1,000 yards across that field. And nothing, in heaven nor on earth, can stop men who fight for their freedom." The men raised their guns and cheered. Hamilton turned to his second-in-command. "Major Fish." Fish ordered, "Forward, men, into the trench." Hamilton led the men as they filed into the trench, followed by 50 pioneer troops with axes to cut away any hazards. Their guns clattered as the men entered the opening. Several moments later, Hamilton emerged just at the end of the trench across from the redoubt, and gave an order back through the line. "I want a representative from each company to come forward and lead the attack with me." 20 men made their way to the front to join Hamilton. Scanning the redoubt, Hamilton heard a familiar voice. "May I join your vanguard, sir?" Hamilton quickly turned, surprised to see his old friend Colonel John Lawrence. Hamilton smiled broadly. "I would be honoured, sir." Lawrence smiled and settled in just behind his commander. Hamilton then peered out of the trench to search the sky for the signal to attack. It came in the form of 5 artillery bursts in the sky. Hamilton looked up and counted. 3, 4, 5. "That's it! Forward, men! At the quick step!" Hamilton leapt out of the trench in an all-out run, sword in hand, the weapon of a field officer. Men funneled out quickly behind him. Hamilton glanced back. One man disappeared from sight into an unseen shell hole. The ground was torn up. Other men tripped and fell, but most were charging forward. Knox's artillery continued to bombard the main fort heavily. Hamilton reached the abatis, which were tightly spaced, sharpened sticks surrounding the redoubt. He directed the pioneer troops, also known as sappers, to chop through them. The British, in their parapets, now discovered the attack. They began blazing away with their muskets at Hamilton's men. A wild yell of "Rush on, boys!" rose from hundreds of Hamilton's troops. A sapper about to swing his axe was hit in the chest by a British ball and fell forward, impaled on the abatis. Hamilton slipped through an opening. Men continued to fall all around him. Artillery bursts inside the main fort intensified. Hamilton jumped on the shoulders of one of his men and climbed onto the fortified wall. Musket fire rained down above him. Hamilton bounded as first over the wall onto the fire step. He drew back his sword and stabbed the first redcoat running towards him. The soldier fell backward off the wall as Hamilton pulled the blade from his abdomen. Another one of Hamilton's officers reached the top carrying his espontoon, a razor-sharp 18th century spear. A bayonet in the thigh greeted him. The American officer wheeled round and drove the espontoon through his Hessian attacker's chest. Hamilton's men appeared on all sides of the square redoubt. Brutal hand-to-hand combat ensued. Butts of muskets connected with heads, eliciting sickening cracks and crunches. The 60 enemy troops inside the redoubt were soon overwhelmed by Hamilton's force of 400 and began to throw down their arms. Quickly more of Hamilton's men vaulted over the parapet. The British and Hessians backing away finally raised their hands in total surrender. The battle had lasted less than 30 minutes. In short order, Hamilton's men squeezed into one side of the redoubt, and the British and Hessians under British Commander Campbell were pinned against the other. Campbell walked to the centre of the redoubt. Hamilton walked to meet him. "Sir, I am Major Campbell. My garrison and I are your prisoners." Campbell unsheathed his sword and held it out with both hands, then bowed his head. Hamilton looked at the shining symbol of victory, then up to the redoubt walls, which were lined elbow to elbow with the men he commanded. He took the sword with both hands and raised it above him, displaying it to all his soldiers. A deafening roar rose from the American troops. Pioneers waved their axes. Infantrymen raised their rifles. Other men pumped their fists. The victory was total. A field outside Yorktown fort. In the distant harbour, a sea of masted French warships anchored close to the shore. In the foreground, British troops emerged from the fort, 10 abreast, and marched in slow, solemn step, with arms shouldered and colours cased. A single commander led them on horseback. He was 41-year-old, Portuguese-born Brigadier General Charles O'Hara. Lord Cornwallis had pleaded illness. Silence prevailed, except for the drummer just behind General O'Hara, who beat a slow cadence. Awaiting the British along the dirt road leading from the fort were the French army lining the left side of the path, and the American army lining the right. It was October 19, 1781. General Washington, looking dignified on his trusted chestnut horse, Nelson, watched the British approach. Hamilton stood just to his right, next to Lawrence and others in Washington's family. The American ranks were silent. Hamilton turned to see the British, then turned to Lawrence with obvious pride. Major Fish, at the end of the row, leaned in and gave a well-done nod to Hamilton, which was returned. Hamilton then slowly looked up at Washington, who remained watching the defeated army approach. Hamilton reflected, for many he had become both saviour and deliverer. His guiding, grounding example allowed my growth into the man I had longed to become. That patriarchal presence had begun to heal a wound that still remained scarred. Several months after the surrender, Hamilton rented a small home in Albany with Eliza and their 10-month-old son, dark-haired Philip Hamilton. In the home, the boy struggled to walk forward toward his father. "Come on, Philip. I know you can do it," Hamilton encouraged. Philip fell on his backside yet again, as the bell rang at the door. Eliza turned to Hamilton. "That must be Mother and Father." "I'll see to them." Outside the small home, Philip and Catherine Schuyler, laden with packages, were anxious to see their new grandson. Back inside, little Philip saw his father walk away. Worry began in his newborn eyes. The boy now struggled to get up. Hamilton opened the front door to greet Eliza's parents. Little Philip was on his feet, unsteady but walking for the first time, with arms outstretched towards his father. Hamilton had his back to his son. "General, Mrs. Schuyler, you're just in time. Little Philip is quite nearly on his feet." Catherine, Philip and Hamilton then turned. and saw the boy walking determinedly towards his father. Eliza walked slowly behind her son, holding a hand out in case he fell, and said, "He became worried when he saw you leave him." The deep pain of his own abandonment struck Hamilton in an instant. He unsuccessfully stifled a tear and brought a hand to his face to wipe it. He walked over, knelt down, and embraced his boy. Through his tears and hugs he whispered, "I shall never leave you, my son. I shall never leave you." Eliza, Philip and Catherine moved in and surrounded Alexander Hamilton and his new son. 19 years later, Philip Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton's firstborn son, would die in a duel defending his father's honour. 3 years later, in 1804, on the same field of honour, a duel with Aaron Burr ended Alexander Hamilton's life at the age of 49.
I hope you've enjoyed this final episode. Thanks for listening. I'm Robert Child, and a reminder you can purchase the entire series of Hamilton at War in audiobook form at the link in any of the episode's descriptions.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.